My name is Mike Wagner. I'm the owner of Cornfield Customs in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been in business 17 years. My experience goes a little bit beyond that, but I'd say pretty heavy in the metal shaping game, 15 to 17 years experience.
When it comes to shaping sheet metal, there's only 5 things you can actually do. You can shrink it, stretch it, cut it, bend it, and weld it. So all we're focusing on in the shaping class is shrinking and stretching. So we're kind of limited. You can only do it so many different types of ways. So I know with Christian, he talked about patterns. So here is the pattern I made off the original rudder cap. I did this part last week, the week before. So it shows my light line here in pencil, and that's where the light reflects. So when you hold that up to a light, you can see this main beam of light reflect around. So that is what that light, this light pencil mark represents, and that's transferred here onto our pattern. And I've got all of our shrink marks laid out, and there's a lot less shrink in the back than there is in the front, and we're going to do that on this power hammer. And then to get this shape here in the top, I'm going to move over to the one behind it, and I have a rubber upper die with a 3-inch lower radius bottom die, and we're going to stretch that up with elasticity. So you can do that with a mallet like Josh did this morning, but as a power hammer guy, I'm extremely lazy. I want to do the least amount of work as possible. So I'm going to let the machines do the work for me. I'm not really good at talking as I do things, so I'm going to try, but make sure to stop me and ask me if you have questions as we go. We ready? Cool. So what I've got is we have the large thumbnail dies set up in the hammer. And the reason I have the large thumbnails in here is this is a lot of shrink. You can see once we get into it, we're going to pull this whole thing over to a 90, and we're going to come to this first set of lines here, and then we're going to, with each pass, we're going to move back one of these lines. That way we can get a nice tight radius, and we can blend that back out. So I'll do one shrink and kind of show you how it works. We haven't done tuck shrinking yet, but we're going to take over the thumb. As the metal comes through, it's going to peel up like this, and then the top die is going to grab it and kind of fold it. I hate to say fold. It's going to gather the material around the die and essentially make it thicker, which is what creates a shrink. So I'll go ahead and just run it in to show you what a tuck looks like. I'll pull it back out, and then we'll put it back in after we talk about it and shrink it. I'm not super familiar with this machine. I've got the 37 HD, which is bigger, and I've got the 19, so if I struggle with reaching up to turn the speed up, it's just I'm used to running my machine, not this one. So that's our tuck. So I don't watch the upper die, the lower die. I watch through the die at what is happening where I'm working. So from this point, our tuck is created, and as we pull the material back out, it will close that tuck, and we can move on to the next one.
The upper die is coming down onto the material. Mm-hmm. Is it crushing the base of the peak, or is it crushing the top of the peak first?
So as it goes in, it's just creating that, it's just bumping that up, and as we come out, it's going to hit here and squeeze that in on itself. Yep. So if you've done any tuck shrinking, it's the exact same process. It's taking the material and it's pushing it in this way as it works out, and it's gathering that to make it thicker. This is often referred to as stack shrinking. You're taking the grain structure and gathering and stacking the grains on top of each other to make it thicker. So there's our first shrink closed. You want to make sure not to just pull the material out. You want to get a nice smooth shrink, and you don't want to hit the edge so hard that you coin that out. Because if you stretch that edge, you're essentially re-stretching the area you've already shrank. So what I'm going to do, if there's not a whole lot of questions, is I'm just going to buzz around this and get the first initial set of shrinks set. Are there any questions before we do that?
How long do you change the amount of time you stay at the edge after coming out, or just try to keep it to a minimum?
Keep it to a minimum. So what I watch is as soon as it comes off the thumb and that edge is pretty much closed, I'm done. You know, I don't let it hammer there, and the machine has to be stopped within reason. So as I get faster, especially if you haven't ran a power hammer before, don't be so concerned with speed. Like, I think I'm 10 years on a power hammer, so once we do, as I'm going around this, it's going to essentially look like I'm running it out while it's still running, but I'm pausing for a split second. It's just getting used to it. So don't necessarily emulate what I'm doing, because I've got a lot of experience on these machines and kind of how the runoff is and how they operate. It's something that would come with time, getting familiar with this machine, a Yoder, a Pettengill. They all operate slightly different. Cool, we ready? And I do a lot of stuff based on the tone of the material. I was talking to somebody about it earlier. Like, I don't have preset settings. The pass before this, it was a lot slower, and it had more of a dull thud. And when I turned the speed up a little bit, I got more of a crisp tone out of the dies. And that's what you want to listen to. You want everything to be consistent. And you can see that, you know, here the tone was good. The tone was good. Here the tone was slightly different. So we have an inconsistency in our shrink, which isn't the end of the world, because we're only focusing on this line right now. Here it's going to get tons more shrink. But you want to listen to how your metal is reacting to the tooling, and the tooling is reacting to your input. So I'm really bad with, like, oh, you need this setting or that setting. It's all based on the tone of the material.
That's not annealed, correct?
This is not annealed. This is straight 3003 H14. I don't really do much annealing at all. It just, for me, it causes more issues down the line. It gets a little gummier, and then it starts that softening to work hardening to softening to work hardening. If I can work it all in its natural state, for me, it works a lot better. So after our first set of shrinks, if you compare it to this one, I mean, it still looks a lot different, but you can see the initial pull down of all your shrinking. So from here, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do another round of shrinking, and then we'll do another round and get it all pulled down and kind of assess where we are. This is a little time consuming because, again, this is a ton of shrink.
On your initial engine laps, do you start applying downward pressure at all?
Nope. Like, if anything, you go kind of in at a slight angle and you pull down maybe 1 or 2 degrees and straight out. Like, you don't start kind of wrenching in, because if you put form in this, it'll trap the form with your shape, and then it'll just get weird. It's not as calculable as if you just go straight in, slight down, and out.
Are you going every round? Are you going to the same spot every time? Or?
Yes, that way I get that nice crisp line here, and then I'll do a nice crisp line there, which it sounds really weird on a bulbous shape like that. You're like crisp lines, but once you start blending all of that out, those will go away. But you know, if you start staggering everything, it builds up odd tension in the panel at this point. So here's our second set, and you can see that it comes flat off the top, over, and then over a little bit more. And from here, the majority of all of our shrinking is going to be to this last line. So we can pull that remaining bit over to essentially a 90. And here on this edge, I've got it noted that I'm just going to shrink the edge as need be. So if we get like a weird waffly spot or a loose point, we can come in and tighten that up. But I'll wait until we get the front shrink and the back shrink, and then just kind of fine tune it. Any questions?
Are you only going in on your same line still, or are you going between them?
On this one, I did on each one, and that pass I did on, and from here on out, I'll do on and in between, just so it blends all of that out. Any other questions?
Somebody without this machine, if they're trying to capture toxin and stuff, how would they have the same or similar control, or would they, based on all of your nice lines? How would you end up with that nice crisp line?
A tucking shrink, or like a tucking fork, and that's going to be a ton. So if you were to do this completely with hand tools, say like a tucking fork and a mallet and a stump, you'd have to break it down and make it in a couple pieces. And I would probably segment it right down the middle. That way it's a little bit of stretch, and then you could shrink the edges and meet in the middle. That's one joy of like the power hammer stuff, is it took me from doing all hand tool work, wheel work, and now it's like I can make as big of a piece as I want as long as I'm man enough to hold on to it. And I mean, we've done, I think Kyle and I did a Model A sedan roof insert in one piece. It was a 4x8 sheet, and it was awful. But we say we did it. You know, it's the power hammer just opens up a lot of new options. And like I do Model A quarters in two pieces. That's the quarter and then the wheel well secondary. I mean, door skins. You can do, say you've got a 34 coupe, you can tack weld two door skins to one another, shape them, cut them apart, and pop one inside out. So it opens up a lot of really cool options. So our edge is getting a little loose here, so I'm just going to come around and just tighten the edge up, and then we can come back and continue shrinking to that line. That way these kind of loose spots aren't going to fight us. So now our edge is back tighter a little bit, and you can see how much that's really pulling it over, and there's still a lot of shrinking. And as I'm working, I'm always trying to pull perpendicular to where our light lines are laid out. If we start pulling at weird directions, it'll pull the metal around and you'll get weird knots and stuff built up in it. So anytime you're shrinking or stretching linear or radial, you always want to work with your light lines. That way you're not building odd shapes. So you can see that's really starting to pull everything over. We're getting a little bit of a hump here, which is to be expected because we don't have any form in this section yet. So what we're going to do is I'll switch over to the other power hammer, and we're going to use a rubber upper die and the 3-inch lower that I mentioned, and we're going to stretch this up or kind of puff it out using elasticity. And one thing, like to get this kind of hump out of there, you can change the form. Just kind of bend it over your leg, and it'll start to flatten that out a little bit. So I run my dies tighter when I run it this way because you're trying to throw it into the rubber. So we're going to focus right inside of our light line area. You can see that it's kind of puffing that up. I'm going to pass it around, and I'm going to crank up the stroke on this so it hits a lot harder, and it'll move that quite a bit faster. So if you have the steel upper in it, you're going to be more planishing, and it's a radial. It'll be a radial stretch. And what we're essentially doing is we're just kind of increasing that by stretching with elastic. So it'd be, this is essentially your sandbag with lead in it, and this is your mallet. Or if you're doing it steel, it would be a mallet against a steel table. It just kind of different process. There's no real path in any of this. Whatever you want. You can start in the middle, you can start one edge. Just the big thing is find out what you like and be consistent with yourself. If you change your process every time, you're going to have different results every time. So did everybody get to check this out, or? So it's, I mean, you get knots and stuff similar to doing it with a mallet, but it's more uniform because you have the same strength hit every time, the same depth. Everything is repeatable. So it's a little bit smoother, but it's still kind of lumpy that you get out of a mallet. So this is where, shrink as need be. I had that little bit of a high spot, which is here, and I took that out just by tightening that edge up. So I'll do the same thing on this side before I continue shrinking around, and you'll watch this edge just kind of tighten up. And I'm not really focused on back here yet. So now that extra material is pulled up nice and tight, and from where my thumbs are, it's relatively consistent. And consistency is key, because if you have a loose spot and you continue to shrink around it and you don't tighten that up to be consistent, that'll translate into a knot later. and I'm watching my edge. So see how the edge is still relatively straight? It's not all crazy zigzaggy from coins and hitting the edge too hard. It's still pretty straight. That's a good indicator that you're hitting your shrinks hard enough, not too hard to stretch everything back out. The part won't be completely finished. If you take this and lay it inside, you can see just how much more shrink is needed. So when we talked about this part last week, we were thinking about doing a back-to-back, me and Kyle, for 2 hours, and I could get this part in about an hour and 35 minutes. So I'm going to shrink in this back edge, which doesn't need as much because it just kind of gradually falls into the rudder. So if you look, you can see that just kind of gently fades down, and as we put the form in it, it'll soften that even more. Without having the rudder here, we're kind of just shooting in the dark without having something to fit it to. One of the challenges on this part was the fact that the wings and rudders were cloth covered. So it's not like you have a solid aluminum piece that you can, take a mallet and tap it to. Everything had to be done off of the part, and it had to be clip fit. So that was one of the more challenging aspects of doing this for the actual aircraft. So I'm going to continue to shrink until Shane turns me off on this, and we'll go over to the air planisher. So it's pulling around pretty decent.
Does the size of your thumbnail die determine the size of the shrink?
Yes, the larger thumbnail dies create a lot more shrink than the mid-size and the minis.
If you're trying to get a lot of shrink at the edge, would you shoot to a smaller one or a bigger one?
You keep the big one in because it's going to shrink a lot more just because the size of the thumb, it's going to gather more. We'll switch over to the air planishing machines. So the question is, if this were made out of steel, would it be the same process and the same repetition? Yes and no. You would do the exact same process, the same layout, and you would just assess if it's not moving as fast as you want, you would need the hammer to hit harder, larger thumbnail dies, or just hit the spots more often. So everything's a case-by-case situation. Nothing is always the same. I mean, I could change the RPM by 5 beats per minute, and it's going to affect the way that things work. So again, I do a lot with tone, so we'll listen to kind of how this is going to hit. And that's extremely too hard. So even that is a little hard, but that'll be good for rough blending. And when we start refining things, we can dial that back even more. So I'm using a rectangle die, and it's 36 this way and flat this way. So that works really good across this long sweeping low crown radius. What size was this one? I think so. So I'm just working around this radius, trying to blend all of our shrink marks out. Kind of where this is fanned over. Let's see if I can just adjust the form. Yeah, that'll work. I was using the flat lower before because this is relatively low crown this direction, but higher crown this way. So being a rectangle, you could kind of bridge across there. And to finish planish this, you're going to be back and forth numerous times between dies. I don't know if anybody talked about keeping your tooling clean and polished. So the nicer your tooling is, the nicer the finished part will be. It kind of burnishes as it works. And you can see, I mean, I don't even use lubricant when I finish planish. Everything's done dry, and I clean it with glass cleaner often, because just the oil from your hands, it has a texture when you planish over it. So if you keep things clean and all your tooling polished and oil-free, it will, you could get stuff off the planisher that looks like a mirror. So, yeah, like if you lubricate it with WD-40, whatever is in the WD-40 will leave that texture on your material. I get a lot of people at the classes at my shop, they don't believe it, so we'll planish one up dry to a mirror, and then I'll spray WD-40 on it, and we'll go over it, and you can watch it dull it. We'll like put a tape line down the middle, and you can see it's duller after we've applied oil. And does that matter in the grand scheme of things? No, because most everything's going to get hit with 36 grit, filler, and painted. But it goes into a pride thing, and then you just want to see if it's possible. So 10 years ago, this would have been a really nice panel. And now, I mean, I could spend the rest of the day on it, refining and getting every small area out of it. So as you're going to progress as a craftsman, your quality and your ideas of a finished part are going to change. Like one of the big things I talk about is you can rough a panel out in no time, you know, to get it to 80%. That last 20% is going to be 95% of the work, and then the remaining 5% of that 20% is another 95% of the work. So again, I had an hour. This one I roughed out in about an hour and 35. The original part that was for the museum was about a 12-hour part to click fit. So we're a little limited on time, but if anybody wants to work on this piece later, you can have it and play with it. Keep fine-tuning it. If you have questions about this or anything else, I'd be more than happy to answer them for you.
Mike Wagner.